What if I told you people once hired strangers to eat the sins of the deceased, or installed bells inside coffins in case they woke up underground? Welcome to the bizarre world of Victorian death superstitions. Let's start with perhaps the most disturbing ritual of them all: sin eating. Picture this: your wealthy father has just died in Victorian England. The family is gathered around his deathbed, but there's a problem. Everyone knows he wasn't exactly a saint during his lifetime. Maybe he cheated business partners, maybe he was cruel to his servants, or maybe he just lived a life full of moral compromises. The family is terrified that his soul won't make it to heaven because of these sins. So what do? They call for the sin eater. The sin eater was typically a social outcast, someone so poor and desperate that they would accept this horrifying job. When they arrived at the house, they would be given bread and beer, sometimes ale, which had been placed directly on the chest of the deceased. The belief was that the sins of the deceased would transfer into the food. The sin eater would then consume this food, literally eating the sins of the deceased, thereby cleansing the departed person's soul and allowing them safe passage to heaven. But here's where it gets even darker. By consuming these sins, the sin eater was believed to take them upon themselves. They were damning their own soul to save someone else's. This made sin eaters some of the most reviled members of society. They were often shunned, forbidden from entering churches, and lived in complete isolation. Yet families kept hiring them because the fear of eternal damnation was that powerful. The practice was most common in Wales and the border regions of England, and while the upper classes would never admit to using sin eaters publicly, the practice persisted well into the late 1800s. There are documented accounts of sin eaters working as late as the 1890s. Imagine living in a society so consumed by the fear of death that you would literally pay someone to eat your sins off your departed body. The Victorians weren't playing around when it came to the afterlife. Now, if you thought sin eating was bizarre, let me introduce you to one of the Victorian era's greatest fears: being buried while still alive. And yes, this fear was so widespread that they invented technology to prevent it. The 19th century had a serious problem with medical knowledge. Doctors couldn't always accurately determine if someone has truly passed or just in a cataleptic state, or even just sleeping very deeply. There are countless historical accounts of people waking up during their own funerals, or, even worse, scratching desperately at the inside of their coffin lids after being buried. These horror stories spread like wildfire through Victorian society, creating what historians call taphophobia, the fear of being buried while still alive. The solution? The safety coffin, complete with a bell system. Here's how it worked. Before burial, a string would be attached to the hand or finger of the deceased, which ran up through the soil to a bell mounted on a stake above the grave. Some versions even included speaking tubes, flags, or breathing tubes. If the person woke up underground, they could ring the bell to alert the cemetery night watchman, who would then dig them up. These devices became so popular that dozens of patents were filed for different versions of safety coffins throughout the 1800s. Some were incredibly elaborate, featuring periscopes, ladders, and even small underground chambers with supplies. Wealthy Victorians would pay substantial amounts to ensure their graves were equipped with these life-saving, or should I say, death-preventing devices. The phrase "saved by the bell" may actually have originated from this practice, though historians debate this. What we do know is that cemeteries employed night watchmen specifically to listen for these bells. Imagine that job, spending your nights in a graveyard, listening in the darkness for the desperate ringing of someone possibly alive. It's the stuff of nightmares. The tragic irony? There's no verified case of a safety coffin bell ever actually saving anyone. The few times bells did ring, it was usually due to natural causes like the decomposition process or ground settling, but the fear remained so powerful that safety coffins were still being manufactured into the early 1900s. Let's talk about something that might genuinely disturb you when you look at old family photographs. During the Victorian era, post-mortem photography wasn't just common, it was practically an industry standard. And I'm not talking about tasteful memorial portraits. I'm talking about photographs where the past loved ones were posed as if they were still alive. Photography was brand new in the 1800s, and it was expensive. For many families, especially those of modest means, the only photograph they would ever have taken was after someone died. This was particularly true for children who had devastating mortality rates due to diseases like scarlet fever, diphtheria, and cholera. Parents who had lost a child would hire a photographer to create one lasting image of their beloved son or daughter. But here's what makes these photos so unsettling. The Victorians didn't just photograph the deceased lying peacefully. They would often pose them in lifelike positions. Past children would be propped up in chairs, positioned with their eyes open, or arranged with their favourite toys. Adults might be posed standing up, seated at tables, or even positioned with living family members who would sit perfectly still for the long exposure times required by early cameras. Photographers became experts at making the dead appear alive. They would use stands and frames hidden behind the body to keep it upright. They would paint eyes onto closed eyelids, or in some cases, prop the eyes open. Sometimes, they would even add a rosy tint to the cheeks to simulate a living complexion. The goal was to create the illusion that the deceased was simply sleeping or sitting for a normal portrait. For modern viewers, these photographs are deeply disturbing, but for Victorian families, they were precious keepsakes, sometimes the only visual memory they would ever have of a loved one. When you understand the context of our high mortality rates, especially infant mortality, and the rarity of photographs, post-mortem photography starts to make a grim kind of sense. It was their way of saying, you existed, you mattered, and we will remember you. The moment someone passed in a Victorian household, family members would rush through the house, covering every mirror, stopping every clock, and drawing every curtain. If you've ever wondered where this superstition came from, buckle up, because the reasoning is fascinating and creepy. The Victorians believed that mirrors were dangerous during the period between passing and burial. There were several superstitions at play. First, they believed that the soul of the past would linger in the house for a period of time before moving on to the afterlife. If the soul saw its reflection in a mirror, it might become trapped in the glass, unable to move on. Imagine the horror. Your loved one's spirit stuck in your bedroom mirror for all eternity, but it gets worse. There was another belief that if a living person looked into a mirror in a house where someone had just passed, they would see the face of the soul staring back at them. Some believed that this meant the living person would be the next to pass on. Others thought that by seeing the soul in the mirror, you created a doorway that would allow the spirit to possess you, or that loss itself might see your reflection and mark you as the next victim. The practice was taken so seriously that entire superstitious protocols developed around it. Mirrors had to be covered immediately. Before the soul left the body, they had to stay covered until after the burial, sometimes for as long as a year in cases of particularly fearful families. The same went for reflective surfaces like polished metal, glass windows, and even standing water in bowls. Stopping clocks had a related purpose. The idea was to mark the exact time of passing and to prevent time from continuing in the house while the soul was present. Some believed that if clocks continued running, they would count down the days until the next passing in the family. Even today, you'll find some families who still cover mirrors when someone passes on, though most don't remember why they're doing it. It's become one of those traditions that persists across generations, a haunting echo of Victorian fear that refuses to go away. And now for the grand finale, the death superstition that you might actually encounter in your own family's antique collection. Mourning jewellery made from human hair. Yes, you read that right. The Victorians would take hair from their deceased loved ones and weave it into bracelets, brooches, rings, and even elaborate wreaths. This wasn't a fringe practice. This was mainstream Victorian culture. After Queen Victoria herself went into extended mourning following the death of Prince Albert in 1861, mourning practices became deeply fashionable. Elaborate mourning jewellery became a status symbol, and hair jewellery was at the centre of it. The process was actually quite artistic. Hair would be cleaned, sorted by shade, and then woven using tiny looms or braided into intricate patterns. Some pieces featured hair enclosed under glass in lockets. Others had the hair woven into chains or formed into flowers. The most elaborate pieces might contain hair from multiple deceased family members, creating a wearable family tree of the dead. The symbolism was powerful. Hair was one of the few parts of the body that didn't decay quickly. It could last for generations, making it the perfect material for a permanent memorial. Wearing hair jewellery was a way of keeping your loved ones close, literally carrying a piece of them with you wherever you went. It was both deeply sentimental and, to modern sensibilities, deeply unsettling. What makes hair jewellery even more fascinating is that it wasn't just about mourning. People would also exchange hair jewellery as tokens of love and friendship while everyone was still alive. A lock of hair became a precious gift, an intimate piece of yourself given to someone you cared about. But the practice reached its peak during mourning periods, where entire outfits would be accessorized with hair jewellery, jet black clothing, and other symbols of grief. So there you have it, 5 death superstitions that the Victorians genuinely believed in and practiced, from sin-eaters damning themselves to save others, to safety coffin bells that never saved anyone, to photographs of the dead posed as the living, to mirrors that could trap souls, and finally to jewellery woven from the hair of corpses. The Victorian relationship with death was intimate, terrifying, and absolutely fascinating. These weren't just quirky beliefs. They were responses to a world where death was ever present, where medicine was primitive, and where the afterlife felt very, very real. The next time you see an old Victorian photograph or a piece of antique jewellery, remember, you might be looking at something much darker than you realise. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Victorian death culture, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below and tell me which of these superstitions disturbed you the most. And if you have any Victorian-era antiques in your family, maybe think twice before you wear that old brooch. You never know whose hair might be woven inside. Until next time, stay curious, stay bizarre, and I'll see you in the next video.